So good afternoon. Good afternoon. How y'all doing today? Great. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our first talk in our Race and Education lecture series of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. As the convener of the center, I would like to thank you for joining us at this very significant moment to discuss the nexus of race, public education in the South. Before we begin, though, I want to thank everyone who played a role in putting this lecture together, especially my co-conveners, Joanna Williams and Rachel Wall, and all the affiliate faculty in the center. I also want to recognize the members of the community for joining us here today. I also want to thank Dean Bob Pianta for his support for the initiative and for the center. So to begin, what is the Center for Race and Public Education in the South? And why is such a center necessary? As a historian of race and education, allow me to share some of my thoughts. In the mid-1890s, the University of Pennsylvania commissioned a young Harvard social scientist named W.E.B. Du Bois to conduct research in Philadelphia's 7th Ward. The purpose of the study was to explore the social conditions of so-called Negroes, an issue commonly known as the Negro problem. Du Bois earned a BA from Fisk University, master's and PhD degrees from Harvard, and studied at the University of Berlin, making him perhaps the most educated black person in the United States at the time. He subsequently produced The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, which is considered the first major sociological study of black life and the black experience in the United States. Du Bois would later head to Atlanta University to lead the first comprehensive set of empirical studies on black Americans called the Atlanta University Studies. The purpose of the AU studies was to identify and publicize the challenges and problems facing the black community and suggest possible solutions. The AU studies conducted from 1896 to 1914 were among some of the first to address the issue of race in relation to a range of topics, including business, education, religion, family life, among others. So how are Du Bois and the research he led over a century ago relevant to our new Center for Race and Public Education in the South? It's very simple. No other study in history has so poignantly addressed race as Du Bois's corpus of work. It is therefore his model of penetrating empirical inquiry that we hope to emulate. Our center will focus on empirical research on black Americans, other people of color, and immigrants in the United States in the 21st century. The work of the center will be an interdisciplinary endeavor encompassing faculty not only in Curry but across the university. In early 2017, Dean Bob Pianta agreed that Curry would be an excellent place for scholars from across grounds to collaborate on research situated at the nexus of race and public education in the South. So we are deeply grateful to Dean Pianta for both his forward-looking vision for the center and for his steadfast support. As we gather here today, the issue of race is as pressing as it was in 1903 when Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Today, the center recognizes the continuing significance of race and its influence on the education of black Americans, immigrants, and transnational students. We hope to be at the forefront of policy discussions and debate, critiquing and analyzing the issue with great precision and depth, and offering viable solutions to urgent problems. The Center for Race and Public Education in the South recognizes that the complex history of race in public schooling has implications for a range of student populations in contemporary U.S. schools, specifically the educational experience of students from immigrant and refugee backgrounds, as they are inextricable from the larger history of race and education in the American South. Thus, the center will include in its mission the schooling and experience of all students of color. So allow me now to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Jerome Morris. When thinking about an ideal speaker for our first Race and Education lecture series, my longtime friend and colleague for, I think, 20 years, Jerome E. Morris, immediately came to mind. I first met Jerome in 1997, I think it was, at the University of Georgia, where we were both new faculty members in the Social Foundations of Education program. If my memory serves me correctly, Jerome, we weren't even supposed to be there. As graduate students, we both applied for an associate professor job posting. I later learned that the search committee had received permission instead to hire 2 assistant professors. The rest, as they say, is history. I do not tell this story either to brag or to show our naivete, although we were a little naive. Rather, I want to recall the idealism the two of us shared, which made us friends almost immediately. One of our very first conversations was about race in education and the need to study it systematically, a discussion that solidified our relationship and made us fellow travelers in the study of race in education. Dr. Jerome E. Morris is the E. Desmond Lee Endowed Professor of Urban Education in conjunction with the St. Louis Public Schools and a research fellow with the Center for Public Policy Research at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. He is one of the premier scholars of race, social class, and geography, and educational opportunity. His interdisciplinary program of research addresses issues related to race and education in the United States, focusing specifically on the relationship between community, families, youth culture, schooling, and the lives of African American students. Morris has researched black schooling in poor and urban settings in major cities such as Atlanta, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Nashville, and he conducted longitudinal investigations of issues of identity, social class, and achievement in middle class and predominantly black suburban contexts in metropolitan Atlanta. And that was sponsored by the Spencer Foundation's major research grant program. And that study was unique, given that most studies on the achievement gap have been based in urban and low-income settings, or in predominantly white middle-class settings. He has received funding he has received funding from the Spencer Foundation, including his pre-dissertation fellowship, small grants program, and the major grants program. Dr. Bartz has been in the forefront of highlighting the centrality of the U.S. South in understanding contemporary African Americans' experiences across a range of areas, especially in education. You may know his 2009 book on Teachers College Press, which is titled Troubling the Waters, Fulfilling the Promise of Quality Public Education for Black Children, which has received tremendous praise for its very persuasive use of ethnographic case study examples and well-crafted theory surrounding his idea of communally bonded schools. And he has just completed writing a book entitled Central City Blues, a community memoir from Birmingham, which is now under review at Oxford University Press. And that study blends social scientific analysis with urban ethnography and community memoir. So this afternoon, we welcome Professor Jerome Morris to the Curry School of Education and the University of Virginia to learn from him, to gain wisdom from him, and to ponder the question, why study the South? Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to present to you my friend and colleague, Professor Jerome Morris.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank Dr. Derek Ulrich for that warm welcome. And it's very delightful to be here at the University of Virginia. Let me backtrack. I used to slip and say UGA, but UVA, and to be in Charlottesville. It's also wonderful to see the tremendous work and the leadership demonstrated by Dr. Derek Ulrich in conceiving and really bringing the inspiration and the enthusiasm that is necessary to launch such a vibrant project that is so necessary at this pivotal point in U.S. history. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Ulrich, for your leadership. And so it's really wonderful to be on this path with you on this journey. I'm delighted. And I know we have a long ways to go, but we've done 20 years, so we're still in the trenches, though. So I present to you Why Study the South, the complex significance of race, place, and educational inequality. I'm going to turn on this mic. Just 1 second here. I need to get this microphone. All right. So everybody, you can hear me now, right? So, all right. I begin. Take it from home and crossed the sea. Some waded, still waters ran deep. In the Syrian sun, cutting came, yearning for light, hope, then rain. Sister was sold from place to place. Later, brother went north, seeking space. Worked a job, made money, owned a home. Come on, man. We got it going on. Breathe a little. But what is free? Then waters came, not a river, but a sea. Now that the floods have come and gone, where is sanctuary? Where is home? This photo shows a slave market in Charleston, South Carolina. Remembering that Charleston, Virginia, and North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, these were cash crop states. States that really set the economic foundation for the United States to become the economic power that it is today. Not on the backs of indentured servants, but on the backs of enslaved Africans. Why? Because the indentured servants, like people who want to pay off their mortgages, say, I'm not going to have a mortgage for 7 years. I'm going to finish mine up in 2 years. So the investors from Europe realize that you can't make money that way. We need a permanent class of workers. Hey, let's go to Africa and get those folks. So they come in through places like Charleston, Savannah. They come in and they begin this experience, this horrific experience, really part of serving as a permanent labor class that would set America on a trajectory that everybody today enjoy the fruits of. And so I always say to people, we have these television shows called Shark Tank, and they're looking for startup capital. Are you familiar with that? Okay. African people are the startup capital to American capitalism. It's been 400 years in the making. Everybody else who came later, you just enjoying the fruits. So this is crucial to understanding where we are, because the South is where it all began. Because if that experiment did not take hold in the southern areas, and we're not calling them states at that time, America doesn't exist. I went to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. Has anyone been there yet? Yes. It started at the very bottom floor. It started in the 1400s. They talk about the contradictions of slavery and the ways in which Africans were complicit in some of that. But this was African people have always had some form of slavery. The world has had some form of slavery, but not the kind of slavery that we saw called shadow slavery in the U.S. Okay, 500 years ago, this is a quote, a new form of slavery transformed Africa, Europe, and the Americas. For the first time, people saw the human beings as commodities, things to be bought, sold, and exploited to make enormous profits. This system changed the world. It coincided with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution didn't come about, or the Enlightenment period didn't come about just people having the freedom to think and ponder the world and these ideas, these brilliant scientific ideas about freedom. It came about because they had a luxury to do it, because African people throughout the colonies and throughout the Americas were working for them to generate new capital. That's really what it was all about, creating new capital. Another quote, the United States was created in this context, forged by slavery, as well as a radical new idea, a concept called freedom, espoused by people like Thomas Jefferson. You follow me? Freedom. But there's this inherent contradiction. I don't have to restate it. You know it better than I do, because you're here in a place that, everybody claims is Jefferson territory. But this is a shared story, a shared past, told through the lives of African Americans who helped form the nation. So we're here at this point, and everybody is wondering why such a place like Charlottesville? This is a bastion of liberalism. This is a bastion of equality here. Why would someone come here? They don't get any cachet going to Birmingham, Alabama. So go to a place that epitomizes liberalism, and then so you can make a national statement. So Charlottesville becomes, I know you don't like it, but Charlottesville becomes that place where the world decided to focus its energies. And it's why it's so crucial in terms of the work that Dr. Aldridge is leading, that we have to take it, grab it, and maximize what needs to become of that. So Charlottesville is here, but it's not just Charlottesville, it's all over this country. But we're here, and we look at these monuments, these Confederate monuments, and everybody is saying, well, you know, this is a reminder of the South and of that horrific past, the Civil War and things like that. And I'm just thinking about when we walked, my family and I, my wife and 2 children, we walked to the Lincoln Memorial, and we saw Lincoln sitting there like Ramses. Oh, I was in ancient Egypt last year. So like Ramses sitting there, and you see, like it's this area called Abu Simbel. It's Nubian area, but sitting just like Ramses. And you see the Gettysburg Address on one side. And then you see the statement he makes about slavery and how it's important for him to keep the Union together. And he says in that, and I know historians will try to say this thing was about states' rights. Lincoln used first person to understand what was going on. Lincoln said it's about slavery. It's about slavery. And he wants to make sure that the Union stays together. So at the core of this, he said, I'll do whatever I've got to do, but we got to keep it together. And we got to deal with this issue of slavery. So we're still dealing with that. We've inherited it. And so, and I say we've inherited, it's like a birthright. It's just what you got to deal with. You know, and so it's something that if you want to enjoy the fruits of America and claim individualism, I had nothing to do with slavery, my ancestors had nothing to do with slavery, but you're enjoying the benefits of slavery, you're part of the conversation. And somebody's got to rectify that, you know. So, but nevertheless, not only do you have those honoring what happened during the Confederacy and the Civil War and that slave past, there are people who are standing up against it. And we saw people here in Charlottesville standing up against it. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and I was at University of Georgia, and it was like, I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and so everybody was feeling good, looking good, but all hell was breaking loose in the rest of the country. And so I got to go where the action is. And so I took myself and my family to St. Louis, Missouri. So you had Ferguson 2014. You had the students at the University of Missouri protesting the football players, saying, we're not going to play another down until you do something. Then you had 2017, the Stockley verdict. We're going to get back to that point, Dr. Aldridge, of whether St. Louis is the South or not. Because everybody said, Jerome, welcome to the Midwest. I said, are you for real? I grew up in Birmingham. I've never seen anything like this. Maybe my mom and them saw it, but I didn't. But nevertheless, we do have people who are courageous enough to say there's something that has to be done. We saw that in Charlottesville. And I was delighted to see a lot of white people out there on the forefront saying something's got to change. So the question, why study the South? And South is pivotal here. But also, what do I mean when I say the complex significance? We know from statistical terms that significance is usually at the 0.05 level, right? And we usually take two variables and say, okay, you know, you see this here, this is important, that's not. But complex significance brings in the fact that you have multiple variables probably interacting here. But I submit that this is something deeper than that. We can look at it and say, what is the racial disparity in terms of education between black and white children? We can say that in 1919 or something, and we see a disparity, and it might be 3-to-1. But then in 2017, and we see the same disparity 3-to-1 in terms of suspension rates or something. And 2017, that's a different kind of significance. You understand that? The gravity is greater because at that point you really are saying, not 100 years later, we see the same thing. So what I'm saying is that complex significance is about where significance takes place across time, place and time. So it's different than just saying, okay, this is that, and we move on. It's like, okay, the gravity of it is much more deep. So what I'll do in my presentation, I'm going to outline and talk about first the demographic data on the South's significance. From there, I'll talk about the intellectual groundings. Then a number of research studies that I've led, and I'll pull from some other data from other people's studies, and I'll highlight those for you. Then defining the South, what do we mean when we say the South? I'll present geographical, historical, and cultural definitions. Then this notion of shaping identity across time and place, how place or region of the country is integral to understanding people's identities and help forge identities, that something does not just take place in a vacuum. And so we'll understand what does this mean, shaping identity across time and place. And I illustrate this with New Orleans. Dr. Aldridge mentioned 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And we know what Plessy did. Created separate but equal. But there's something else that Plessy did too. Very different in New Orleans that we've never seen before, really. And I'll talk about that. Then I'll use some research from others, the Ad Health study, to highlight adolescent identity and how place is crucial in that. Then I'll talk about the importance of place and the Black Mecca study, Black Mecca being a moniker for Atlanta, Georgia, some work I'm leading, still writing on. And then I'll talk about the South and the Midwest, St. Louis at the crossroads. And so I'm going to pull from a couple of articles, major articles. One is going to be, well, three of them. The first is going to be an article I wrote in Educational Researcher with a colleague, Carter Monroe. She was a postdoc, worked with me on my Spencer grant. And it's called Why Study the South? The Nexus of Race and Place in Studying or Researching Black Student Achievement. Then I'll pull from another article. I edited a special issue of the Peabody Journal of Education called Race and Opportunity in the American South. And I present to you adolescents' perspectives on race and opportunity in Black Mecca. So in a place of opportunity. And then I'll pull some from an article I wrote. It was published in the American Educational Research Journal. It's called Can Anything Good Come from Nazareth? And it's from a study across cities, St. Louis and Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm pulling from those three to make the points in this presentation. Percent black population in the South. And I want all of you scholars, sociologists, historians, psychologists, everybody to kind of join me in this conversation here. Let's look at this here. Percent black population in the South. 1865. We see 95% of black people basically reside in roughly 10 states. Almost all of us. Du Bois did the Philadelphia Negro. He's writing around the late 1800s. He studied Philadelphia because it was the place where a whole bunch of southern migrants made their way up north. And he's like, what's going on? The white folks like, we got a whole bunch of Negroes here. We need to figure out what to do with them. Dr. Du Bois, why don't you study them? Why don't you be a researcher? Du Bois realized that research is not something that's disconnected from who he is, though, because their intentions for studying or researching were very different from his. And so Du Bois, what he did is say, but I still want to do this work, even if you won't hire me at the University of Pennsylvania. I still want to do this work. And he studied the 7th Ward in Philadelphia. And in studying the 7th Ward, what Du Bois was able to do, he gives us a methodological framework called the social study. And in the social study, he says, if you want to study people, you've got to study them where they are. If you want to study people, study them where they are. So Du Bois moved into the community for 18 months. He resided there and studied black migrants from the South. Because the black folks up north in Philadelphia were already there. Like, okay, we got some problem with these Southerners too. You know, so Du Bois was studying that area, And so he made his argument for the social study. He would use in-depth ethnographic work coupled with descriptive statistics to really understand people. So taking Du Bois' methodological approach is what I do in my work, is that let's look 95% of black people 1865 and take about 45 years later. What percentage of black people still live in the South? 90%, okay? So when do we see that drop, and what causes this drop between 1910 and 1940? Just tell me, class. The Great Migration, right? The Great Migration led to millions of black people in different ways, though, moving up north because of two things: to escape the oppression of the South, but also to participate in the economy of the North. So there was a push and pull factors. There were push and pull factors going on. So we see this major drop. But from 1619 roughly to about 1919, 300 years, where do most black people live? In the southern United States. So tell me, why do we have so many studies of black culture, black people, black identity based in New York and Chicago? Why? 3/4, almost 85% of your time, of the people's time, has been primarily in 10 states. But the definitive study, I'm not calling anybody out, but the definitive study, so-called, in the academic community take place in Chicago just because Chicago has some nice universities there. But these southern schools did not grab that. We push University of Georgia. You got to grab it. University of Alabama, University of South Carolina, grab it. If you're going to study black people, become the epicenter of the study of black people. Why? You have no choice, really, because we can't understand black culture. We can't understand people like Snoop Dogg, right? Because he sounds like folks from Mississippi and Louisiana, but we are not familiar with the work that Isabel Wilkerson wrote in terms of The Warmth of Other Suns, and talked about how black folks went out west around the 1950s. So those are new people. And I don't know if anybody is here from California or not, but for the most part, they're recent migrants to the area. You know, we're old school, Derek and I. Derek's from South Carolina. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. So he's real old school in terms of steeped in the history. Your folks are probably brought there in the 1700s. I know mine were there in the Alabama becomes a state later, but around mid-1800s. And they probably most likely were sold down south, because my folks really came from South Carolina. So let's look at this here. We see this shift up until 1970. And then in 1970 onward, we're beginning to see an incremental increase, primarily because of Atlanta, Georgia, and places like that. And so Atlanta, Georgia is called the Black Mecca, and we're witnessing that going on now. So this is a visual here for you to get a sense of what's going on. But let's even go beyond that. And let's look at what it's called, it's like density of black people. I hate using the word concentration, so I didn't want, it's pejorative, it's negative to me. So I just say density. So density of black people, look at the urban areas. See these green spots here? Those are the areas, the central cities or the metropolitan areas throughout. And you see, this is where black people are, basically in particular places for various reasons, for opportunities and also for protection. You know, protection socially and psychologically. But nevertheless, where are most people still in terms of density-wise? In the South. Let's look in 2010. This is another map I've updated. And this is by counties. The dark areas, 50% or more of the people are African-American people. And where you see most African-American people low, the highest density. Mississippi, you see that? You see some parts of Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, you know. So you see some areas here. So black in the South. The other thing is that a lot of people who, if they're doing research on rural communities, and they say they're incorporating their research rural black communities, 90% of all rural black communities are in the South. Another is the South is the home to 9 out of the largest predominantly black metropolitan areas. So if somebody says, I'm studying urban black America, if you're The only other urban, predominantly black area I know is Gary, Indiana. That's the only area. Everything else is southern. Southern. From Memphis to it used to be at Louisiana, New Orleans, but that's gone. Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, those areas, they are predominantly black areas. Now, I know Chicago has like the second largest percentage, and New York, so those are numbers, relatively speaking. But in terms of predominantly black metropolitan areas, 9 out of 10 are southern cities. Did you know that? You got to read my article then. Hey, doctor, I'm going to make sure I forward it to you. All right? Because if you didn't know that, 9 out of 10, that's amazing. Scholarly and intellectual groundings. I pulled from this work, Geography of Educational Opportunity. There have been a number of scholars who've done some work around this. Most of you probably know William Tate has done some work, and he talks about GIS, and I've been pushing that in terms of my work around the South. And so we're all like part of a community of people trying to bring this into education. The race place nexus, saying basically where you are has implications for race. I can talk more. And we put a Du Boisian framework. I've already talked about the social study research approach, really pulled from Dr. Derek Aldridge's work about Du Bois' intellectual thought and ideas. And specifically, one of the things I want to mention that Dr. Aldridge did is he and I, all of you have heard about the talented 10, right? So Dr. Aldridge, he went through and found all kind of research that Du Bois embraced that at one point, but hey, he also had something called the Guiding 100. So Dr. Derek Aldridge's work informs this work here because it's about a social justice approach. Because you have this notion that we're going to educate a talented 10. You're basically saying you're counting on a group of people who are already in a precarious predicament to try to uplift the masses. They can't do it because black middle class status, as Mary Patilla McCoy and others have researched, is already fragile. It's already fragile. They're trying to hold on themselves. They can't reach back. So the Guiding 100, as you've talked about in your ed theory piece, your Journal of Negro Education piece, the Guiding 100 is saying it's not about just getting a token group of black people. We need to prepare all black children for leadership. And so Du Bois has his Guiding 100. Why is that important? Because everybody lost the rise of the black middle class, but as black folks, we bemoan the conditions of the black underclass. And we know it's not good to feel that tension because everybody needs to move up. Social studies of black community life from St. Clair Drake to Horace Cayton, and Horace Cayton to Du Bois's work inform what I do. Educational history. And Dr. Aldridge, I know you call it, I'm going to call you Derek too, man, but, I'm formal right now. But, hey, I pulled educational history, and Friedman at the forefront of public education in the South, in the center, is the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. We know from James Anderson's work, right, that black freedmen were at the forefront of bringing about public education in the South because the white planters had no interest in it, even for poor white people. And anytime a civil rights game is out there for black folks, what do white folks say? We want some of that action too, right? And so white people often, as critical race theorists say, become the primary beneficiaries of it. And black folks, even though you're at the forefront of pushing something, become the secondary beneficiaries. And so the educational history piece is that Friedman at the forefront of public education, knowing, as Dr. James Anderson said, it would have come years later had it not been for black people demanding an education. So this is why we have to center, with all due respect to everybody else, you have to center black people in this conversation. Have to be centered. So I'm going to present also in terms of the work I've done, ethnographic investigation, urban communities and schools in St. Louis and Atlanta. I've talked about in my book, Trouble in the Waters, as well as an article, Can Anything Good Come from Nazareth? Dr. Aldridge mentioned about the community memoir from Birmingham and social study of black adolescents in black suburbia in the South. So these are the projects that will frame this work here. Defining the South geographically. We know kind of like in this somewhat tropical area of the South, we think of states south of the Mason-Dixon line. So geographically, we kind of have a general sense of what the South is, right? But also historically and politically, we think of the South as those states that seceded, right? But there was also states that didn't secede, and Delaware, right? Didn't break off and say we're going to join the Confederacy. Delaware. So where does Delaware fit geographically? So you have to have multiple ways of understanding the South beyond just a geographical definition. Then you also have to have a cultural definition. We think of certain foods. We know it's diverse culturally. If someone says, well, I'm doing, you know how we have to do as researchers, have some degree of anonymity when talking about places. We'll say things like, well, I studied a large urban center in the South. My question is, was it Memphis or was it New Orleans? If you don't bring in this place piece, New Orleans is radically different from Memphis, Tennessee. They're both on a river. But, and then you study Atlanta and Birmingham. No. So I argue that we cannot just speak in generalities, just speak generally about the South and just say a southern area. You know, there's different histories associated with each one. The other thing, culturally, I was in Missouri and I'm in St. Louis, and on an outskirt, we had some friends from Memphis came in town, and there was this, we went to a Halloween hayride. It's my first time on a Halloween hayride. And so I'm on that hayride, and I'm on the back of this little wagon, and I'm on there, and there's this guy, he has his bottle, and he's doing this here. And he starts spitting back in it. I'm like, what is he doing? You know, he spits back in it, and it smells minty like. I said, what is, okay. Then I looked to my friend to my left, who's from Memphis, Tennessee. He really is from Mississippi. And then the guy, this white guy I'm sitting next to, he asked me he's like, where you need something? I was trying to understand, and I can't articulate what he was saying, but in essence, he was asking me where was I from, and I looked at my black friend to my left. I said, man, what did he say? He said, Jerome, he asked where y'all from. I said, you figured that out? He said, and so I was saying to myself, I said, I remember meeting white people from the rural areas of Birmingham, of Alabama, and they sold peaches in this area called Chilton County, Alabama. And they would talk like that, but I couldn't pick that sound up anymore. I guess I became too educated, but I couldn't pick it up. And so this guy really epitomized culturally, living in the St. Louis area, that the South is not just the Deep South. The culture is still there. And we know it when we think historically in terms of the Civil War. 30,000 Missourians fought for the Confederacy. Okay? We know how Missouri entered the Union, right? What Maine comes in free, Missouri comes in slave. Okay? So we know that history. And so, you know, even though there were points in time in which black people went to St. Louis for great opportunities, because it's all relative. You know, come from Mississippi, St. Louis is better, you know. But the thing is that the cultural definition is also important here. Now, shaping identity across time and place, I alluded to New Orleans and the complex hierarchy of race. And one of the things that a lot of people talk about separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson, knowing Booker T. Washington made a statement in 1895 at the Atlanta Exposition in which he said we can be separate like fingers on a hand, but we work together, then black people and white people can uplift the South. In some ways, Du Bois talked about acquiescing to white supremacy. 1896, we see Plessy versus Ferguson pass. But let's think about Plessy. Plessy, what was New Orleans like? Who knows, anybody from New Orleans? What was New Orleans like before Plessy? What type of hierarchy did it have in terms of race? Was that?
It was color.
Yeah. It had white people at the top, colored people or free Negroes in the middle, and then black people at the bottom. For years, it operated with a tripartite system or a three-tiered system. And if you see people from New Orleans, you can see various ranges. You'll see black people from New Orleans, very dark or very light, generally. Not just this anecdotal, and I'm not, we got to be social scientists, but generally you see those patterns. So one of the things you have is that New Orleans has had that tripartite system until Plessy. Plessy said, the court said, we don't care, Plessy, if you're 7/8 white. We don't care. You're still black. You still can't sit in the front of that train. We don't care how light-skinned you are if you said that you should be considered white. But why is that important? It's important because it's about the inheritance of racial status. If you look at any cultures, any communities, many societies are patriarchally structured throughout the world, and the wealth goes from the father to the sons usually, or you trace the lineage through the father quite a bit. Quite often you will see in terms of inheritance. And so what happened here in the U.S. in terms of the slave system, it was a slaveocracy is what it was. It has shifted it and said, well, we're not going to bequeath to the offspring the wealth of the children from the father. What slavery did is said, if the mother is enslaved, then what? If the father is free, then what? Are still enslaved, but the mother's enslaved, right? Okay. Now, why are you passing everything else through the father, but you're going to flip it when it comes to their wealth? It's about property. It's about economics. Those were economic decisions because if the children of the slave owners could inherit the wealth, a lot of us wouldn't be as broke as we are today. Because we're all in the family. So you would have some of that wealth, and we didn't get that wealth because the system was set up, and that's why this one-drop rule thing here. Because Plessy, no matter how light-skinned, but what it does, Plessy concretizes this notion of black and white binary. So we now went from a multi-tier system of racial stratification to a two-tier system. And why the rest of the world and why everybody else who comes to the United States are always trying to figure out, why do folks always want to try to ask me if I'm black or white? You can be from Asia or India or wherever, but if you come to the southern U.S., it's like, is that person black or white? No, that person might be something else. But we always force people into that binary. But that binary has a history to it. It evolved, and Plessy cements that binary relationship. So that's why New Orleans is different, and why we can't say, let's study New Orleans, and then act like New Orleans is the same as Memphis. Okay, let me go back here. And then there's another race, geography, and adolescent identity. There's an ad health study. Any of you familiar with the ad health study? Looked at all of these schools, middle school, high school, thousands of young people. And basically, there was a part that asked them to identify. It was like 2007. There were multiple ways of the ad health study. And asked young people to identify. And found out that young people who identified as having parents from two races, so to speak, black and white, were significantly more likely to say that they were black if they had one parent that was black. 75% would say black compared to 25% would say white. Okay? Now, and that seems like, okay, that makes sense, but here's the other thing that's important, is that place was significant. Place was significant. So if you grew up in the South, you were more likely, significantly more likely, to identify as black versus growing up in other parts of the country. Let's operationalize that, okay? Let's take Tiger Woods. And why Tiger Woods? He said he's Caucasian. Tiger Woods in California versus Tiger Woods in Mississippi. Give me an answer. What is Tiger Woods in Mississippi? He would identify, basically, if you take that research, he would identify as black. He wouldn't tell you he's Caucasian. He'll say, I'm a black man. And he might sound like me and Derek, you know. Derek and I, whichever way you want to frame it, but he'll sound like us. So Tiger Woods, but I illustrate that to say that we've got to understand why place is pivotal here. This is not play stuff. This is real because it's about how young people identify. It's about it's how they feel. It's not just about that. It's also how they see the world seeing them. They could come in with this very innocent way of seeing oneself, but then the world sees them a certain way, and they've got to deal with it. And that's why we've got to have what I would call, and some colleague, a friend of mine, David Bloom, we call it complementary research. So research that's not just quantitative or qualitative, or people try to say mixed methods. No, they should complement one another. You know, what this can't do, this one has to do. So that's what we're striving for. And that's why this kind of understanding is important. But we also got to not just deal empirically, we've got to deal theoretically and conceptually too. So it's not just about, okay, here's the empirical data, but what is the thinking behind that empirical data? And the importance of place, and I've talked about that we often have this, and we wrote about it in the article, the omission of the significance of place. That's often what we see in research. The treatment of place as an incidental backdrop rather than a deliberate backdrop. I see some amens, some head shaking. What's up? Yeah, I see that. Centering race, place, nexus, and survey research, why this is important. And let me just illustrate this part about the survey research. If you think about the Ad Health study or any other studies, if someone, based on what I presented earlier, if you took a survey of African American people, what can you infer about that survey that one should do if you're studying black people in the U.S.? What can we say that in terms of sampling, what should we do? Should what? Okay. We should oversample the southern U.S. Is that clear? Similarly, let's take Asian Americans. Where do most Asian Americans in the U.S. reside? West Coast, right? So if you're going to do a study of Asian Americans' experience, a national study, doesn't it make sense that you oversample the West Coast in that study? So that's what this is about, that even in survey work, we can't treat it like, okay, you just do it ethnographically or qualitatively or whatever. Even in national studies, we need to oversample areas. So it's really that kind of thinking. So the poverty percent of black and white children in the South, let's get into this part here. And I'm going to further talk about my points here. And a lot of times we'll say, well, you have poor and white people. What about white people in the South? You know, you got to deal with that, and you got to think about that. I say, yes, we got to deal with that in all of the U.S. Let's go to the far right there. We see 33% of black children live in poverty in the U.S. We see 10% of white children. Go to the southern U.S., Alabama, 42%. Mississippi, 41%. Louisiana, 44%. 3 or 4 times greater. You see that. And some people will say, well, you got all these other factors, out of wedlock births. I say, that was going on during slavery. You know, some daddies didn't take care of children back then. Okay? So it's not anything new to us. So the point is that there are a lot of things that are going to create this pattern, but this is what we see here. This is what's going on, and why we have to pay attention to race and class in the conversation. It is not like one is greater than the other. But the other part that I had to make sense of that for myself in this book, and it's under Oxford University Press. We're trying to get it published, but it's written. It's a community memoir from Birmingham. And one of the things is that there was a community I had grown up in called Central City in Birmingham. And I would go back to Birmingham, and a lot of my friends would say to me, and even siblings, And let me just give you a backdrop. My mother, there were 6 boys and a girl. I'm the youngest of the 6 males. I have a sister under me. And so we all grew up in a public housing community in Birmingham. And what would happen, all of my friends, I'd go back and they'd say, hey, Jerome, man, we're proud of you. Man, we all had the same opportunities as you had. I said, man, no, we didn't. And I said, you forgot. We just came out of little country areas of Alabama. You know, Birmingham was a big city. Many of us, our families got there in the 1930s. Because Birmingham is a city that was founded after the Civil War. So Birmingham really doesn't have that history. A lot of people don't think about Birmingham like it's a new history. But they don't think about that, well, we were just on the plantation, okay? And then we moved to Birmingham and the steel mills and the factories, and we weren't making that much money, so some of us went up north to Detroit and places like that. But they didn't also realize that Birmingham has had this history, though, of confining black people, segregating black people. Almost every person's mother cleaned white folks' houses. Everybody. And all the communities other than the middle-class area called Smithfield, where Angela Davis and Condoleezza Rice have connections to. You know, like, it was a middle-class enclave almost in any city. Birmingham had it. So other than that, almost all of us grew up in the alleys. Families lived in the alleys. And so I would talk to my friends, and they said, well, man, we should have studied hard, and we should have done this, et cetera, et cetera. And so internalizing their failures and attributing it to this notion that I should have worked harder. And I say to them, did you even know that we grew up in an area called 35203? That's the area code, or the zip code. And at the time we were growing up, it was considered the poorest zip code in the United States. Did you know that? They don't know that. They don't know that. 73% of the families lived in Central City were below poverty. They don't know that. And the thing is, so when they're trying to understand something, they'll say, Jerome, we should have been like you. And I say, you know, they say, you traveled to Japan in high school. I said, yeah, I did. I got the opportunity. But my mother couldn't pay for the passport picture. So somebody else paid for it. The city of Birmingham public school system paid for it. And somebody bought my suits and everything. But Birmingham, trying to get from up under that history in the civil rights movement, said, we're going to support the opportunities for young people to travel to Japan. Birmingham has a sister city relationship with Hitachi City, Japan. And I was one of 4 students selected. 2 black students and 2 white students. Birmingham system is 90% black. I didn't have to tell y'all that joke, right? But we want to look like we're fair to everybody. We want to look like we're fair. And so you created opportunities for 2. So only 2 slots. I told them there were only 2 slots. There should have been 9 out of 10 slots. And then 7 more of us would have benefited and probably have become a professor. But that didn't happen. So it's not about the will, the desire, it's about the opportunity. And I was a beneficiary of some of those opportunities. I got selected for it, and I benefited from it. The other thing is that this shows you the racial ethnic disparity in terms of neighborhoods. So place, I'm further hitting home this notion of place. The typical poor white child, 13.6% poverty rate of a neighborhood. Typical poor black child, 29.2%. Almost still double or twice. And here's what's shocking even from this, is that the typical middle-class black child grows up in a community worse off than the typical poor white child. And we don't think about that when we look at why the black middle class is struggling. Maybe the black middle class lives in a community that's been divestment, or it doesn't have grocery stores. There's a food desert. Or everybody has to travel somewhere. You don't have sidewalks. I don't know. But the ecological context of the place is what we don't consider when we think about these issues. Census data, percent black population by region. This gives you a census here. Still the South is holding on, increasing. And so those were the negatives. Not negative, but those are that kind of a picture that, it's like, okay, here's hear the struggles. Well, what if we think about people in a different area? What about black people who are in an area of black mobility, black upward mobility? What about an area like Atlanta called the Black Mecca? How might the notion of opportunity be perceived? What are the academic outcomes for black children in those settings? We know John Ogbu, the anthropologist, had done some work in Shaker Heights, Ohio, basically concluded, what he's always concluded, is y'all folk, black folks, you know. And so, but he studied black people in Shaker Heights, Ohio. He was looking at the black middle class, shifting it, and saying, let's not just study the black poor, let's look at middle class black people. And he did that. He interviewed black adolescents. And so I got a Spencer Foundation major grant. I said, I want to do this differently. Pulling from some of the historical work, looking at the migration of black people back to the South. And so I said, what about if we study black middle-class children, or middle income, in predominantly black spaces, not predominantly white spaces, but an area that's perceived opportunity? What if we shifted that? So growing up in Black Mecca is this work here. So I raised the question, this is the research question, how do black adolescents growing up in a predominantly black and mostly middle-class suburb of the U.S. South make sense of their social, political, and economic realities? And how does this influence their identity and understanding of the role of education in their lives? And I am embarking on a study that will look at the South, Atlanta, juxtaposing Atlanta with St. Louis, because there's been a lot of tension in St. Louis. And I want to know, how do young people growing up in St. Louis feel about their opportunities, especially in the post-racial era or a Trump era now? And so a lot of the work I had done in Atlanta was between 2006 to 2011. So Barack Obama is the president during that period. And then also within an ethnic enclave, you know, that has these political and cultural images of black upward mobility. Then ethnographic interviews with observation with 75 black adolescents and their families between 2007 and 2009. Survey data collected during spring 2009 and spring 2010 from 1,329 adolescents across 3 demographically different high schools. These high schools are in predominantly black county. We call it Brown County. We see this area here. The dark red is where the black people are, and the lighter is where everybody else is. And there's a major highway traversing the county. And the county is like South Brown County, North Brown County. That's how people speak of it. And this is what it looks like in terms of where people live. So it's a bifurcated county, really. But everybody's in the same county. And what's amazing is that people never use the word race. They'll say, well, those of us in South County, those of us in North, it's really like that. They can't utter us black folks in South County or something. They can't say that. Here are some of the homes. Look familiar? This is a neighborhood. But state, it's in, we can say it's in Georgia. It's in the metro Atlanta, Georgia area. That's all I can say. Here's some of the young people from there. Uh-oh, I got a name of it. But no, that wasn't it though, really. But let me, I want to play for you something that this kind of captures a little bit of the work, say a little bit about what I do here in that area. I realized that the South was an often overlooked area of research around the experiences of black people. My research specifically focuses on the sociology and anthropology of education, with a particular emphasis in educational reforms and policies and how these affect issues of access and outcomes in schooling, particularly around issues of race, social class, and gender. And I am right now paying greater attention to the role or the significance of place, that is one's geographical location, in determining outcomes and opportunities. But I would argue that the direction, you can't try to understand the experiences of black children around issues of achievement just by interviewing black adolescents and getting their perspectives. One has to understand what are the structures of schools that create situations that that become cultural manifestations, such as this notion of whether some black children were ridiculing other black children for achieving. What created that? When you look at the structure of schools, you often find that black children, even in racially diverse schools, are at the bottom. White and now Asian children are at the top. I think what we have to do in order to solve the achievement gap is to focus on the structural forces. You have to have great teachers, you have to have quality courses, and black children have to have access to those courses in those schools. So that changes the structure. That begins to address the structural issues. You can ask almost anybody. They will tell you many black girls are doing extremely well. And the achievement gap sometimes or quite often falls along gender lines. And so we have to have renewed conversations about the education of black males. And in that conversation, one inherently has to raise questions about the school-to-prison pipeline. One inherently has to raise the questions about how do we understand, or how do black communities define issues of black masculinity. One inherently has to think about what are forces in schools that are in many ways pushing black males out. And so this is not something only the black community can deal with. This is something that all of us have to address. And before I began the work that I'm doing, I made sure that I was a resident in the area. In fact, where I reside now is a key community in the study that I'm leading. And you have to deal with the politics of the community, the same issues that the community is experiencing. You feel them. And so you have to think about being a researcher while you're also a member. And that's a unique approach. I would see a lot of young people in the DeKalb County area, and they were playing football, and I realized it was a skill that I had, and they just called me Pop. You know. In fact, it's like church on Sunday morning. We show up around 11:30, and we just play football for about 3 hours, generally beginning with a conversation about life and ending with conversations about life. And so there are a lot of little things that I do that are just who I am in terms of an educator. This is a gift I was given, and that is to participate in the education of young people. So from that research project in the Metro Atlanta area, there's this article. She's works for Mathematica, a young lady, scholar named Sarah Woodruff. And we kind of gleaned this notion of, from surveying these young people, that this notion of inheriting racial awareness. And I'll talk more about that. So we had a question that was posed. Although my parents tell me to get a good education in order to get a good job, they face barriers to job success. Percent strongly agree or agree. So we have 69% of black students, black adolescents across those three schools agree with that statement. 53.8% of white, 57.9% mixed. Understand that 80% of the population comprised of black students. So black students are highly represented in this. And mixed race and other groups are not highly represented, period. But you still see higher number with them too. And these are those outcomes that are significant here. Based on their experiences, my parents say people from our racial ethnic group are not always paid or promoted according to our education. Percent strongly agree. 55.8% black adolescents, 25.3% white adolescents. Almost look like the Rodney King verdict or the O.J. Simpson trial, right? And mixed race, 46.8%. And other group, 58.1%. Significant differences by race. School is a positive place for me. You just posed to, how many of you believe that black students versus white students were more likely to say school is not a positive place. Okay. How many of you believe black students would say school is a positive place, more likely than white students to say that? So only about 4 people responded. I have a very low sample of respondents. Wow. But I know nobody wants to be wrong, right? Let's look. 87.2% of black students said school is a positive place for me. Now, this is in a certain setting, okay? So let's keep that in mind.
Where?
In Metro Atlanta. And I want to know, would students say the same thing in Atlanta, in St. Louis? And let me just backtrack for a second. I need a few more minutes here. When I took the job as the E. Desmond Lee Endowed Professor of Urban Education at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, I would meet white people. Many of them in St. Louis were from Chicago or place elsewhere. And they would say, Jerome, what brings you here? And I say, well, I took the position. And they said, wow, St. Louis is a wonderful place. And I'm not trying to reduce it to this. Really, I'm not. But then I would randomly meet black people in a park or meet them in a grocery store or meet them at the department store. And they'll ask me, what do I do? And I say, they asked me, where am I from? I say, well, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm originally from Birmingham. I never leave Birmingham off. But I said, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, just got here. And they asked me, why do you come here? I said, I took a job here. He said, do you have a very good job? I said, I'm what they call an endowed professor. They said, I have to explain what that is. And a lot of people just weren't paying that much attention. And they were basically, man, why in the hell did you come to St. Louis, Missouri? And I said, why would you leave Atlanta to come here? I said, I got a good job. Or I'd say, well, I came here to do the research, to do the work. But they could not understand it. I understood it. My family understood it. Derek, we understood it. They couldn't understand it. And so I've got to, make it a good decision, as best as I can. Because they're like, man, you went from the outhouse to the something else house. So, nevertheless, I say that because we got to think about differences in terms of people's perceptions across place. So we see black, 87.2%, white, 74.4%. So black children feel more positive than white people. So when people say to you, well, black children hate school, not really. I was not really. And that's something, this attitude achievement paradox that has been talked about. Rosalind Mickelson, John Ogbu, a number of people who have written about that, this attitude achievement paradox. Why do black children like school so much, but it's not commensurate with their outcomes in school? Why is that? So we deal with this in that article too. Sarah Woodruff and I addressed this. And mixed race, 80.2%, and other groups, 84.4%. And here's some qualitative data here. So research, we asked the students, some people say that racism is a big problem in our society based on your experiences and opinions. What do you think about that? Say it's sad. I think there's always going to be a little secret racism. Like I remember when I was young and I went to Florida with my friend and like this white male, he was being like really rude to me and I was like, and I think I was 11 then. And I was like, why are you being so rude? And I didn't really understand, but I think there's always going to be a little secret racism anywhere you go. Another, do you feel these kinds of feelings will ever affect your education or what you plan to do after high school? The student continues, no, I'm still going to go to college. I know there's going to be white people and everything, and I mean, that's going to be different for me because I'm used to majority black. I mean, it's not going to change my learning. I'm there to get the information, not because of the people that I'm sitting next to. I'm sorry. Being post-racial or hopeful. Do you think race factors or racism can make a difference in your education, your pursuits of higher education? Dennis, a student, said, I don't believe so. Maybe I just might be naive about the situation, but I don't believe that race will really play not enough of a role to keep me from getting where I want to be. You want young people to respond like that, right? And you can't hold me back type thing, And we wonder if it's a function of the setting. So this notion of racial inheritance is continuing. And this student says, I think they would treat you a lot different because they expect certain things out of black people. Man, Let me just read it. I think race plays a big role in whether people can move up from what I hear. She says, I haven't really experienced any racial issues. But from what I hear, my parents and all these people say, I think race plays a big part because when you try to get a job in America, they go based on your skin color instead of what you know. Now, those are the subjective perspectives. Now, let's look at the objective conditions. We see, in terms of black and white male academic outcomes in Brown County, if you can see that well, we see the blue part, 47% of black males graduation rate. Suspension rate, 15%, the red part. And gifted and talented, 6%. Let's juxtapose that with white males in the county. 72% graduation rate, suspension rate, 3% compared to black males, 15%. Participation in gifted and talented, 34% white males compared to 6% of black males in a predominantly black county. Okay? So they can say whatever they want to say. This is what we know. These are the objective conditions in terms of that are taking place in that county. So, and we could talk about that. Now, here's the other thing that I want to show you. Like, when you look at this here, and this is a map of percentage of high school football players recruited by a Division I school, major college sports school. Somebody knows the South is significant, right? Somebody knows that. They say, if I want some top football players, I start in Florida. If I can't get them out of Florida, I go to Georgia. And if I can't get them from Georgia, I go to Louisiana. Sounds like something like the slavery, right? Okay? Somebody knows. But whereas they can use that to recruit mostly our black males, why can't we use similar type of geographical information to inform us about education? Visual literacy. And Mark Hyberby and Bill Tate talk about this use of visual literacy to deal with social justice issues. And so we can do that same thing, but the NCAA already knows what's going on. Okay, they know where we're going to make this money at. So St. Louis at the crossroads, that's where I am right now. It's within a border state, so I'm now there grappling with these similar issues, rather, not the same. But it's a border state that legalized slavery, landmark cases. I think people forgotten that Dred Scott decision took place there. I don't know what they're thinking of. But it was the destination for black migrants. Everybody black, almost everybody, 90% from Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee. 2014 Ferguson unrest, the Stockley verdict, these are reminders. And we see all these other, this is St. Louis, a little bit like Charlotte. But one of the things Dr. Aldridge and I were talking about, you know, we grapple with this notion, what is a researcher? Do we do research in this tradition, in the traditional ways? And we recognize that, and you wrote that beautiful piece in Ed Researcher about the dilemma and duality of an African-American educational historian. And you talked about that you're not just researching, you're part of that conversation. And I'm reminded of John Hope Franklin. He said we have to tell something like this, the total truth. And he was talking about what was going on in terms of the African American History Museum. Unapologetically, we tell the truth. So if we're going to be researchers, we got to pull from traditions that are beyond what we've been trained to do. So this is not really research like in status quo research, let me call it that. It's not status quo research. This is research that's got to be transcendent. It's got to be transformative. It's got to take us to another level. This is what I call, now, we always have to go back to a song to help us understand, because in any struggle, in any research tradition, the people always pulled from those strengths. When they were in those darkest moments, when they had no hope, they had to turn within in order to be inspired to continue to move on. And this is what we have to do today, because this work is what we call freedom work, just like the people had the freedom songs back then. Thank you very much.
global research, and that there's this other level, this regional level that you can be considered. So I was wondering, as a researcher starting a project, especially one that's not grounded in the region, how does one start to think structurally about the region in the South?
You say that's not grounded?
So if I am, as the researcher, am doing research in the South, and I'm thinking primarily about this as an ethnographic case, or when I'm doing in-depth ethnography, how does one start to structure their thinking regionally rather than locally, and how one begins the analysis?
And you're not from the area you're saying?
Yeah. What would that approach look like? And I also wanted to ask you, on a similar note, I also appreciated your point that one can't only look at the individual, but one is also needing to understand the interaction of individuals and systems, and that much of how we understand our race is based on how we are treated, and both legally and socially and politically. So I would also love to hear a little bit about your thinking and how you structured those interview questions, as well as how you structure any interview on racial identity without reinforcing or calling up stereotypes that youth might not have about themselves, might not use to think about their own lives.
Well, let me just get to the first question you asked. First is like, how do you become become trusted in a community?
No, it's more how do you, if one is, so I liked your point that we can't only think locally and we can't only think broadly, we have to think also regionally, that there's this region that we're grounded in. I'm just wondering, how do you, or how does one start analyzing based on region rather than just locality?
Right. How do you begin? You have to, my way of, and it's not like a formula here, but you have to think like historically, politically, and culturally. And for me, that's why I mention it like that. That needs to frame the way you approach it. And so you'll get different answers because you think, for example, the Midwest, you might have this geographical definition, but there's a cultural definition. And so I would kind of suggest that you think about it like that, at least using those two. And when you think, and one can even think economically too. Mm-hmm. So I would bring that into the conversation when trying to understand region. And also, if you're engaging issues around race, like how was race constructed in those places? How was opportunity afforded or constructed in those areas? Now, the other part you were asking about, like how do you ask questions of young people without being stereotypical? It's kind of, when you frame ethnographic questions, you really are trying to get them to talk about their experiences more than really trying to prompt them. So they have to be very semi-structured in terms of the interviews. And the other thing, at first I thought is where you were going in terms of like accessing communities. That's where I thought you initially were going. And one of the things I want to say in terms of a way of thinking about that, this might be just adding on to what you had raised initially, the first question. And that is, how do you become more than just a participant observer in the process? A lot of times we're taught to be like participant observers, and that's what we learn. But Kenneth Clark in Dark Ghetto, we researched New York, particularly Harlem. One of the things he came away with this notion of the involved observer is what I was illustrating in terms of when I lived in that neighborhood. That you're grappling, you're trying to figure out where will your children go to school? What house? Where will you live? You know, so you're up here saying, well, I live in a good neighborhood. My children, and it's a good school, but you're black people in the area, and so you still have to struggle with those issues. And Kenneth Clark comes up with this notion called the involved observer, and so you're participating in the structure, the hierarchy, and you're trying to make sense of it. So it's more than just saying, I'm there and I'm doing the research. You have to, you're experiencing the fate of the community too. So what becomes of it becomes of you and your children. How do you in many ways, as parents, protect your children from that. And so you're part of that conversation. That's a very different thing. Is why Du Bois, he lived in the 7th Ward, and he was researching. He didn't have children at the time, but he was there 18 months and really experiencing that. Now, I'm trying to do some of that in the work I'm doing in St. Louis, because I've done it in Atlanta, and I saw a neighborhood, was racially diverse. When I first moved there, like 3-4 years later, it was like all black, and we were there 15 years, and I'm in the black section of town, and so that's just what you get. But the thing is how do we do that in our research is another question. Will universities support that kind of work, and especially living in areas that are very stressed economically? Thank you for a great question. I probably answered some of it.
Yeah. So just going to take some more questions, and we're going to have a reception after.
So I actually have political science.
Okay.
Adolescents said last night that in looking at place and all the different aspects of it, that we need to define what the South is. He said Virginia is no longer the South, it's the Mid-Atlantic.
Okay.
What do you think he based that on? Was that just purely political, or, what would have that be a statement that somebody who's been studying politics would say? That's my political question. The psychological one, maybe I have to read the article, but I'm still trying to figure out why did those black adolescents say that they had a positive experience in school? You said we had, why did they do that? And then you sort of went on to the next thing, and I'm still thinking, why? I'm assuming it had something to do with the peer relations and the opportunity, but I just wanted to...
There could be a number. The first, in terms of, he says it's the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, he's
right.
calling Virginia Mid-Atlantic.
Okay. Maybe he's trying to make Virginians feel better about themselves. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is. Or, and there obviously are some nuances in terms of changes over time, clearly. But, I would have to ask that question. I don't know what he's thinking. I can't answer that for him. The other part, in terms of the young people, they were in a predominantly black, more middle-income area. And Du Bois talked about this notion that during the 1940s, when Du Bois, at first he was staunch integrationist, and he pulled away from an integrationist model, and he argued that black people should close ranks, because at one point he was very optimistic about developing these interracial alliances with white people, poor black people and poor white people. He thought there was hope, and then he came to a realization that, no, it's not like that. So Du Bois argued closing ranks to protect one psychologically, to protect your group. And so he talks about these forming ethnic enclaves, similar to what immigrant groups often do when they first come into the U.S. They form these ethnic enclaves. They allow them to generally operate within the confines of the community, psychological protection, speak their language, eat their foods, but also to then move into the broader society. And so Du Bois kind of came to that understanding. So that could be playing out in this area here. The other thing, though, too, is that I think sometimes it could be protecting oneself psychologically, too. If you ask people, you can ask people, no matter how poorly they're performing in school, say if they're making D's and C's, and you ask them about school, you ask, do you think school is important? They say, yes, it's very important to get an education. They would say that. So some of it, people would talk about that. But in this article that Sarah Woodruff and I wrote, and I can forward it to people, we analyze that thoroughly. And we talk about why they possibly do this. And it's part of that attitude achievement paradox conversation. So that's the answer I can give to it.
What kind of conversation?
The attitude achievement paradox. The attitude achievement paradox. And so they have positive attitudes, they have negative achievement, and that's the paradox.
So we're going to have to close up now. We're out of time, but let's give Professor Morris another round.
Thank you very much.
reception, we have a reception at 8, so please feel free to join us and ask Dr. Morris more questions. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.